Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are conducting what I think is going to be a bit of a forensic audit.
A forensic audit. I like that.
Yeah, we're looking at a reputation that has been, set in stone, essentially fossilized for about 500 years.
At least.
We're tackling a figure who looms over Western history like a massive gray skyscraper. You can't miss him, yet somehow most people only ever see the shadow he casts.
Right. Never the actual building itself.
Exactly. We were talking about the man, the myth, the lawyer, the theologian, John Calvin.
It's good to be here. And you are absolutely right about that shadow. I think if we were to walk down the street right now and ask 10 random people what comes to mind when they hear John Calvin, I guarantee 9 of them would give you the exact same cluster of words.
Oh, I can hear them now.
You'd hear joyless, you'd hear severe, you'd definitely hear predestination.
Yes.
Or my personal favorite, the big one, theocratic dictator.
Oh, absolutely. The mental image is immediate. I picture a guy in a severe black robe, maybe a fur collar, just frowning at a child for laughing.
Banning
dancing, canceling Christmas, and telling everyone they're going to hell and there's absolutely nothing they can do about it.
Right.
It's the ultimate frozen, chosen caricature. It's almost like he's the villain in a Footloose movie.
Yeah.
But, set in the 16th century.
That's a perfect image. And to be fair, it's one that his enemies, and frankly some of his stricter followers, have helped cultivate over the centuries.
Sure.
But our mission today is to take a sledgehammer to that marble statue. We want to peel back layers of centuries of bad PR and find the actual human being underneath.
Okay.
Because the reality is so much messier and honestly infinitely more interesting. We aren't talking about a statue. We're talking about a French refugee, a brilliant humanist lawyer, and this is the part that always shocks people, a man who never actually wanted to be a pastor in the first place.
That is the hook for me. The idea that one of the most influential religious leaders in history, the guy who has an entire ism named after him,
Calvinism, yeah.
was essentially dragged kicking and screaming into the job. So our goal today is to explore how a guy who just wanted a quiet life of books, a little wine, and some study ended up reshaping our views on work, government, capitalism, and even the human soul.
And to do that, we have a massive stack of sources. We aren't just skimming Wikipedia here.
Right.
We are pulling from historical biographical data, his huge collection of correspondence letters to other reformers like Philip Melanchthon, where he really lets his guard down and complains about his health and his enemies.
So the juicy stuff.
The really human stuff. We have records from the Geneva City Council, which read like a legal drama. And of course, his magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion.
Which I assume is a light beach read, something to take on vacation.
It's about as light as a concrete block, but it's essential. It's one of those books that built the modern world. And for you, the listener, here's the value proposition, the why should I care factor.
Yeah, why does this matter?
Whether you are religious or an atheist, whether you identify as a Calvinist or you run the other way when you hear the name, Calvin's ideas on checks and balances in government, the Protestant work ethic, and the value of universal education have likely shaped the society you live in.
Wow.
You can't really understand the architecture of the modern Western world without grappling with this lawyer from Noyon.
So let's not bury the lead. Let's go back to the source. You mentioned he was a lawyer from Noyon. Let's set the scene. The year is 1509. The world is changing. Where does the John Calvin story begin?
We're in the Picardy province of France, in a town called Noyon. It's an old cathedral town, very steeped in the medieval way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And on July 10th, 1509, a boy named John Calvin is born.
John Calvin. So John Calvin is just the anglicized version we use today.
Correct. And to understand John, you really have to understand his father, Gerard Cauvin. Gerard was not a warm and fuzzy figure. He was a self-made man, very ambitious. He was a cathedral notary and a registrar for the ecclesiastical court.
Okay, let's pause and translate that into modern terms. What does a cathedral notary actually do? It sounds like he just stamps papers.
You should think of him more as a high-level administrator or maybe a corporate lawyer for the church.
Oh.
He wasn't a priest. He was a bureaucrat. He knew where the money was, he knew how the patronage system worked, and he knew where all the skeletons were buried.
So he was a fixer.
He was a man who understood the machinery of the institution.
Yeah.
And Gerard had a very specific plan for his sons. He wanted them to climb the social ladder. He didn't want them to be peasants. He wanted them to be power players.
So the classic ambitious dad living vicariously through his kids. You're going to be a doctor, or in this case, you're going to be a bishop.
Precisely. Originally, the plan for John was the priesthood, not because Girard was particularly pious necessarily,
Right.
but because the church was the best career path for a bright boy from the middle class. And in fact, Calvin was something of a child prodigy. He was incredibly precocious. By the age of 12, he was already employed as a clerk by the local bishop.
Wait, employed at 12? I was barely managing a paper route at 12, and I wasn't very good at it. How does a 12-year-old work for a bishop?
It was a patronage system. It's called a benefice. Basically, you get a title and a salary, often funded by the revenue of a specific parish, and that money is supposed to support your education.
So it's a scholarship.
It was a scholarship, but it came with ecclesiastical strings attached. He even received the tonsure at that age.
The tonsure,
Yeah.
that's the haircut, right. The
Yeah.
Friar Tuck look with the bald spot.
Exactly. They shave the crown of the head. It was a rite of passage, symbolizing that you were now, in a sense, property of the church. You were a cleric in the making.
That's intense for a 12-year-old.
It gave you legal status. You were now under church law, not civil law. So, picture this. At 12 years old, John Calvin is walking around with a bald spot on purpose, marked out for the priesthood. He goes off to the University of Paris, specifically the Collège de Montaigu, which was famous for being incredibly strict.
I've heard of that place.
Erasmus went there and complained about the bad eggs and the harsh discipline. Calvin, however, thrived. He was a grinder. He was a serious student.
So he's on the fast track to becoming a bishop or a high-ranking theologian. He's got the haircut, he's got the scholarship. But then there's a pivot. The outline says his father changed his mind.
Yes, and this is a crucial turning point. A few years later, his father, Girard, had a falling out with the church authorities in Noyon. It was a financial dispute involving the administration of an estate, and suddenly he looked at the changing world and made a pragmatic calculation.
Okay.
He pulled John out of his theology studies and told him to go to law school instead.
Why the switch? Did John lose his faith? Was there some kind of scandal?
No, it was purely about the wallet. According to Calvin's own account later, his father realized that lawyers made a lot more money than priests.
Huh.
You have to remember, the nation-state was rising, the King of France was consolidating power, bureaucracies were growing, law was the new boom industry.
Yeah.
It was the tech sector of the 1520s.
Some things never change. Forget the soul, son. Look at the billable hours.
Exactly that. So, dutiful son that he was, Calvin packs his bags and goes to the University of Orléans and later Bourges to study law. And I cannot stress this enough. This is the key to understanding who he became.
How so?
He wasn't just memorizing statutes or loopholes. He was immersed in the intellectual movement of the day. Humanism.
Okay, we need to pause on that word, humanism. When we hear that today, we think of secular humanism, atheism, putting humans at the center of the universe instead of God. But that's not what it meant in the 1520s, right?
Not at all. It's almost the opposite of secularism. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement that was all about a Latin phrase, ad fontes.
Ad fontes.
It means to the sources. The idea was that the Middle Ages had been a period of darkness, fog, and corruption where layers of tradition and bad translations had obscured the truth.
Okay.
The humanists wanted to bypass the medieval clutter, the middlemen, and go back to the original texts of antiquity. They wanted to read Roman law in the original Latin, Greek philosophy in the original Greek, and most importantly, the Bible in its original languages.
So it's like textual archaeology,
Yeah.
digging through the mud to find the original artifact.
That is a perfect analogy. And Calvin fell in love with this. He learned Koine Greek, which was a dangerous skill at the time.
Why dangerous?
Because it allowed you to read the New Testament in the original rather than relying on the Latin Vulgate, which the church had used for 1,000 years. And if you can read the original, you can start to see where the church might have gotten things wrong. You start to see that the word for do penance in the Vulgate is actually repent or change your mind in the Greek. That changes the theology entirely.
So he's building this toolkit. He has the logic of a lawyer, the critical thinking of a scholar, and the language skills of a linguist. He's becoming a weaponized intellectual.
Yes. In fact, his first published book wasn't about the Bible at all. It was published in 1532, a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia.
Seneca, the Roman Stoic.
The Roman Stoic philosopher, yes. Calvin wanted to make a name for himself as a classical scholar, like Erasmus. He wanted to be the smartest guy in the literary world.
That is fascinating. So if you met John Calvin at a dinner party in his early 20s, he wouldn't be lecturing you on predestination. He'd be boring you with nuances of Roman legal theory and Stoic philosophy.
Precisely. He was an intellectual snob, essentially. He approached faith with the logic of a lawyer and the linguistic precision of a scholar. But then something happened. The timeline is a bit fuzzy, but somewhere between 1532 and 1534, the lawyer becomes the believer. He breaks from the Roman Catholic Church.
The conversion. Now, in the notes, it says there's a bit of a mystery here. Most famous religious figures have a clear road to Damascus moment. Luther had the lightning storm. Augustine had the child singing, "Pick up and read." What was Calvin's moment?
It depends on which text you read, and this speaks to Calvin's personality. He was notoriously private about his inner life. He almost never wrote about himself.
Why not?
He believed that talking about his own experiences was a form of vanity, but we have two main accounts. In the preface to his commentary on the Psalms, written much later, he writes that God, by a sudden conversion, subita conversio, subdued his mind to docility.
Sudden conversion, that sounds dramatic, like a lightning bolt.
It does. He describes his mind as being hardened like a beast, and God had to break it open. But then we have a letter he wrote to Cardinal Satellito, we'll talk about him later, where he describes a much longer, more painful process.
Okay.
He talks about being alarmed at his spiritual misery, trying to find peace in Catholic rituals and failing, and eventually condemning his past life with groans and tears.
Groans and tears. That sounds agonizing. It sounds like a mental breakdown or a deep depression.
Yeah.
So which was it? The lightning bolt or the slow burn?
Most modern scholars, like the biographer Bruce Gordon, argue they aren't contradictory. The sudden part might refer to the final decision to break away, the moment the decision was made, while the groans and tears describe the long period of wrestling that led up to it.
I see.
You have to remember, leaving the Catholic Church in 1530s, France wasn't just changing denominations. It wasn't like moving from a Baptist church to a Methodist one.
No.
It was treason, it was heresy, it was risking being burned alive.
And that danger became real very quickly, right? I'm looking at the Cop incident in 1533. This sounds less like a theological dispute and more like a scene from a spy thriller.
It really does. So Calvin is in Paris. He's hanging out with these underground reformist circles. His good friend, Nicolas Cop, is elected rector of the University of Paris.
A big deal.
A very prestigious position. Cop has to give an inaugural address on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1533.
High-profile gig. All the faculty are there, the dignitaries.
Exactly, and usually you'd give a boring speech thanking the faculty and praising the king. Instead, Cop gives a speech that quotes Erasmus and Luther. He calls for reform and renewal in the church, and he attacks the conservative theologians of the Sorbonne, calling them sophists.
That is a bold move.
Too bold.
Yeah.
It was a declaration of war. The faculty denounced it as heresy immediately. Cop had to flee Paris that very night to avoid arrest.
Wow.
And because Calvin was such a close friend, the authorities assumed he was involved. The casual rumor is that Calvin helped write the speech, or at least influenced it heavily, so the police came for him too.
So he's on the run.
Legend has it he escaped out of a window using bed sheets, though that might be apocryphal, but he definitely went into hiding. He used aliases. He was Charles d'Espiville for a while. He went to Angoulême and sheltered in the library of a friend, Louis Dutillet. He was effectively a fugitive, moving from safe house to safe house, relying on a network of sympathizers.
And the heat got turned up even higher with the affair of the placards in 1534. What was that?
That was the tipping point. Up until then, the King of France, Francis I, had been somewhat tolerant of the humanists because his sister, Marguerite de Navarre, liked them.
Okay.
But on the night of October 17, 1534, radical Protestants put up anti-Catholic posters or placards all over Paris, Orleans, and other cities, and these posters were incredibly offensive to Catholics. They attacked the Mass, calling it gross abuse and idolatry.
So this wasn't a polite request for dialogue. This was graffiti warfare.
It was a massive provocation, and one of these placards was even found on the door of the king's bedroom at the Château d'Amboise.
Whoa. That is a massive security breach. That's like finding a threatening note on the president's bedside table inside the White House.
Exactly. King Francis panicked. He felt his authority was being challenged. He cracked down hard. He started burning people. Dozens were arrested. Several were executed. Calvin realized there was no future for him in France. The environment had shifted from cautious tolerance to active persecution.
He had to get out.
He fled to Basel, Switzerland, which was a Protestant safe haven.
So he's a refugee. He's left his home, his career path as a lawyer, his country. He's stripped of everything. And this brings us to what the notes call the accidental pastor. Because at this point, sitting in Basel, he still doesn't want to lead a church, right? He just wants to write.
Not at all. In Basel, he keeps his head down. He writes the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. It was published in 1536. But even then, he viewed it as a handbook, and crucially, as an apology. a defense for the faith to the King of France.
Okay.
He wanted to prove that Protestants weren't anarchists or rebels, just faithful Christians. But his personal ambition hadn't changed. He wanted to be a writer, a scholar. He wanted to go to Strasbourg, which was a German free city, find a quiet corner, and write books.
The introverted dream. Just me and my library. But then comes the detour that changes Western history.
It is one of those great what-if moments. In July 1536, Calvin is trying to get to Strasbourg, but there are military maneuvers happening. King Francis I is fighting the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The direct road is blocked by troops.
So he has to go around.
He has to take a detour south. He decides to stay for one single night in Geneva.
One night. Just a stopover.
Just a layover. He stays at an inn, probably under an assumed name, but someone spots him. We don't know who. Maybe a former student, maybe someone who had read the Institutes.
Because the Institutes had made him a minor celebrity by now.
Yes, it was a bestseller in the underground market. So word gets to William Farel. Now we need to talk about Farel.
Okay, who's Farel?
Farel was this fiery, red-headed, explosive French reformer who had been trying to turn Geneva Protestant. Geneva had just thrown out its Catholic bishop and declared itself independent, but the city was in religious chaos.
Right.
Farel was a great agitator. He could start a riot, but he wasn't a great organizer. He was drowning in the details. He needed a brain.
So Farel hears the brain is in town for one night. Does he send a polite invitation? A fruit basket?
Farel didn't do polite. He storms into the inn, he confronts Calvin and demands that he stay and help reform the church in Geneva.
And Calvin says?
Calvin refuses. He says, look, I'm 27 years old. I'm a scholar. I'm shy. I'm not healthy. I need quiet. I can't do this public leadership thing. I'm not a politician.
I can relate to that. Please, just let me read my books. He's putting up boundaries.
But Farel wouldn't take no for an answer. And this is the cinematic moment. Farel stands up, likely towering over the younger Calvin, points a shaking finger at him, and thunders, and I'm paraphrasing but closely, "You are following your own wishes, and I declare in the name of God Almighty that if you do not assist us in this work of the Lord will punish you for seeking your own interest rather than his."
Wow.
He literally curses Calvin's retirement.
That is intense. A curse from a fiery preacher in a candlelit inn. That would terrify me.
It terrified Calvin. He later wrote in his introduction to the Psalms that he felt stricken with terror, as if God himself had reached down from heaven and laid his violent hand upon him to stop him.
So he actually believed it?
He felt he had no choice. He was superstitious enough or faithful enough to believe this was a sign. He agreed to stay.
Talk about being guilt-tripped into a job. Nice soul you have there. Be ashamed if God cursed it.
Yeah.
So he stays. He's the reluctant recruit. How does it go? Does the brilliant scholar lawyer fix Geneva overnight?
It was an absolute disaster.
A total flop.
A total failure. You got to understand the dynamic. Geneva was a rowdy commercial city. They had just kicked out their prince bishop because they wanted political freedom.
Right.
They didn't want a new set of rules. Then here comes this young, serious French intellectual. And remember, the Swiss and the French have always had a bit of tension, telling them they need to stop gambling, stop sleeping around, and sign a confession of faith.
I can see the clash coming. It's the classic town versus gown problem. The academics versus the locals.
Exactly. Calvin and Farel drew up these articles on organization. They wanted to excommunicate people for immoral behavior. They wanted the power to ban people from the communion table.
And the city council.
The city council looked at this and said, "Who do you think you are? We didn't get rid of a bishop just to replace him with 2 pastors."
And then there was the bread riot. The notes mentioned something about unleavened bread. Sounds so petty.
The bread riot. It sounds silly to modern ears, but liturgy was political. The city of Bern was Geneva's powerful military ally. Bern used unleavened bread for communion like a wafer.
Okay.
Calvin and Farel didn't really care about the bread per se. Calvin actually preferred ordinary leavened bread, but they didn't want the civil government telling the church how to worship. It was a jurisdiction issue. The council ordered them to use the Bern-style wafers to keep the alliance happy.
So it was a power struggle. Church versus state fought over a cracker.
Exactly. It came to a head at Easter, 1538. The council ordered them to use the wafers. Calvin and Farel said, "If we can't control the altar, we won't serve communion at all." They went on strike during Easter services.
Oh, wow. No communion on Easter. That's like canceling Christmas dinner. That's the Super Bowl of the church year.
It was explosive. Riots ensued in the church. Swords were drawn. It was chaos. The next day, the city council fired them both and gave them 3 days to get out of town.
Banished. So much for the divine calling. Farel's curse didn't seem to work out.
Calvin was arguably relieved. He essentially said, good riddance. He wrote, if we had served men, we would have been ill-rewarded, but we serve a great master who will pay us what he owes. He headed to Strasbourg, which is where he wanted to go in the first place.
So he finally gets his wish, and this begins what the outline calls the Strasbourg interlude. This sounds like the happiest time of his life.
It really was. From 1538 to 1541, he lived in Strasbourg. He was invited by Martin Bucer, who was a much older, wiser reformer. Bucer became a father figure to him. He basically took Calvin under his wing and said, okay, you have the raw talent, but you have zero people skills. Let me teach you.
So he's in rehab for failed pastors.
In a way. And it worked. He became the pastor of a church for French refugees, so he's back among his own people, speaking his own language, not struggling with the Swiss dialect, and he learned how to be a pastor. In Geneva, he was trying to be a ruler. In Strasbourg, he was a shepherd.
What did that look like?
He visited the sick, he counseled people, he buried the dead, he expanded the institutes, he wrote a brilliant commentary on Romans, he even introduced congregational singing the Psalms. Before that, the people just listened to choirs. Calvin wanted the people to sing their prayers.
And this is also where he gets married, right? The Calvin and Love section. I have to say, the quote in the notes is hilarious. He tells a friend, I am not of the mad kind of lovers who embrace even the vices of those they are in love with.
He was very practical, unsentimental. His friends urged him to marry to help with the household and his health. He was always sickly.
So they were matchmaking for him.
They were. And he gave them a list of requirements like a job description. He wrote, the only beauty which allures me is this, that she be chaste, obliging, not fastidious, economical, patient, and careful for my health.
He was hiring a spouse. Must be good with budgets and nursing. It sounds so cold.
It sounds unromantic, but he eventually found Idelette de Bure. She was a widow of an Anabaptist he had converted. She had 2 children. And despite the pragmatic beginning, by all accounts, they had a deeply affectionate relationship.
We see a crack in the robot armor here.
Absolutely. It was a short marriage. She died in 1549 after only 9 years together. And Calvin was devastated. He wrote a letter to his friend Verret saying, I have been bereaved of the best friend of my life. She was the faithful helper of my ministry. From her, I never experienced the slightest hindrance.
The best friend of my life. That's beautiful. It completely contradicts the emotionless statue image.
It does. It shows he was capable of deep connection and deep grief. But his time in Strasbourg couldn't last. Geneva was falling apart without him.
They realized they made a mistake.
Chaos returned to Geneva. The Catholic Church tried to win the city back. Cardinal Sadoleto wrote a very persuasive letter inviting them back to Rome, and the city council didn't know how to answer it. They were out of their depth.
They needed their intellectual heavyweight.
They realized they needed a heavyweight to debate the cardinals and organize the church. They needed their lawyer back.
And I assume he jumped to the chance. I told you so.
He was horrified. When the letter came asking him to return, he wrote to Farel, rather would I submit to death 100 times than to that cross on which I had to perish daily 1,000 times over.
He called Geneva a cross.
A place of torture. He remembered the riots, the insults, the stress. He did not want to go back.
But he went.
He felt it was God's will. He couldn't say no to duty. In 1541, he returned. Strasbourg lent him to Geneva for 6 months, but he never left. He arrived with a wagon for his family, and he stayed until he died.
So this begins the main act. Part 4. Return to Geneva and the theocracy debate. This is where the rubber meets the road. He sets up the ecclesiastical ordinances. How did he structure this new church?
He defined 4 offices: pastors to preach, doctors to teach so, the academics elders to discipline, and deacons to care for the poor. But the controversial part, the engine of the whole controversy, was the consistory.
The consistory. That sounds like a sinister secret society in a Dan Brown novel. What was it?
It was an ecclesiastical court made up of the pastors and 12 lay elders, and the elders were elected by the city council. Their job was to maintain the moral discipline of the city.
How?
They met every Thursday. If you were caught gambling, fighting, beating your wife, or skipping church, you got summoned to the consistory.
And this is where the theocracy label comes from.
Yeah.
People think Calvin was the Ayatollah of Geneva, just running everything.
That is the myth. But historians have really pushed back on the word theocracy. If by theocracy you mean the church ran the government, that's just false. Calvin held no civil office. He wasn't the mayor. He wasn't a counselor. He was a refugee pastor who wasn't even a citizen of Geneva until near the end of his life.
Wait, he wasn't a citizen for most of that time?
No. As a French refugee, he had no voting rights. He couldn't run for office. And crucially, the consistory had no civil jurisdiction.
What does that mean, practically?
They could scold you, they could excommunicate you, meaning bar you from communion, but they couldn't fine you, imprison you, or kill you. Only the city council, the little council, could do that.
But didn't the council just do whatever Calvin wanted? Wasn't he pulling the strings?
Definitely not. For most of his time there, from 1541 to 1555, the council was controlled by his political enemies. They fought him constantly. They hated him.
Let's talk about those enemies, the libertines. Again, sounds like a fun party group, but I suspect they weren't.
They called themselves the Patriots, or Children of Geneva. Calvin called them libertines. These were the old, wealthy, established families of Geneva. They hated that this French refugee was telling them how to live. They felt he was destroying their culture.
The notes mention some specific clashes. Tell us about the card maker.
Pierre Ameau. He was a manufacturer of playing cards. Calvin's preaching against gambling was, hurting his bottom line.
Right.
So one night at a dinner party, Ameau gets drunk and starts shouting that Calvin is a Picard, which was a slur for Frenchmen, and a teacher of false doctrine.
Just a drunk rant at a party.
Yes, but word got back. The council arrested him. Calvin wanted a modest punishment, but the council, in a weird twist, decided to humiliate him to show they were serious about order. They forced him to walk through the city in his shirt sleeves, kneeling at intersections to beg for forgiveness.
That's incredibly harsh.
And Ameau's family never forgave Calvin, even though it was the council's sentence. It created a vendetta.
And then there was the dancing incident.
The Ami Perrin affair. Ami Perrin was a military hero, the captain general of the city. He was a libertine leader. His wife, Françoise, was caught dancing at a wedding.
Dancing was illegal.
Lascivious dancing was banned. It was seen as a prelude to adultery. Françoise was defiant. When she was called before the consistory, she screamed at Calvin, calling him a wicked man, and saying her father had been a citizen of Geneva before Calvin was even born.
So it became a huge political fight.
A massive power struggle. Perrin tried to destroy Calvin's authority to excommunicate. It was a question of, can the state tell the church who can take communion? And Calvin's answer was, over my dead body.
It sounds exhausting. He's fighting the government every single day.
And the threats were real. People named their dogs Calvin so they could kick them in the street. They shot muskets outside his window at night to keep him awake. And then there was Jacques Carré.
This one seems darker.
Much darker. Gruet was a wealthy libertine. One day, a threatening letter was found on Calvin's pulpit. It basically said, you'd better get out of town or you'll get what's coming to you. We won't wait for a trial.
A death threat.
Yes. The council investigated. They searched Gruet's house and found papers attacking Christianity itself, calling Jesus a fraud and mocking the Virgin Mary. In the 16th century, that was blasphemy and treason.
And what happened to him?
Gruet was tortured and beheaded.
Beheaded. That brings us to the edge. And we can't do a deep dive on Calvin without jumping off that edge into the biggest shadow over his legacy. We have to talk about Michael Servetus.
No, you can't avoid it. It is the defining controversy of his life. If you know one bad thing about Calvin, it's that he burned Servetus.
So who was Servetus? Why was he so controversial?
Michael Servetus was a Spanish polymath, a genius, really. In the history of science, he's actually famous for being the first European to correctly describe pulmonary circulation, how blood moves from the heart to the lungs. He was a doctor, a geographer, and a theologian.
A brilliant scientist, then.
And a radical heretic by the standards of the day. He wrote a book called The Restoration of Christianity, where he denied the Trinity. He believed the doctrine of the Trinity Father, Son, Holy Spirit was a corruption, a three-headed Cerberus. He also rejected original sin and infant baptism.
Now, for the modern listener, denying the Trinity might sound like a theological technicality, but in the 1500s, this was nuclear, right?
It was a capital crime. You have to understand the pollution mindset. Pre-modern people believed that heresy was like a virus. If you let a heretic spread his ideas, he didn't just have a wrong opinion. He was infecting the souls of the community, damning them to hell, and inviting God's wrath upon the city.
So it was a public health crisis.
Exactly. And both Catholics and Protestants agreed on this. Anti-Trinitarians had to die.
So he was wanted by everyone.
Everyone. The Catholic Inquisition in France had already arrested him in Vienne. He managed to escape prison, but they burned him in effigy. He was a dead man walking in Catholic Europe.
So he escapes the Inquisition and decides to go to Geneva. To Calvin's city. Why on earth would he do that? That seems suicidal.
That is the great mystery. He and Calvin had corresponded years earlier. It did not go well. Servetus sent Calvin insulting letters. Calvin eventually stopped writing, telling Farel in a private letter, and this is very damning, "If he comes here, if my authority is worth anything, I will never let him depart alive."
Ominous. A very clear threat.
Very. So Servetus shows up in Geneva in August 1553. He goes to Church St. Pierre Cathedral while Calvin was preaching. He was recognized by someone in the congregation and arrested.
And this is where the libertines get involved.
This is where it gets political.
Yeah.
The libertines Ami Perrin and his crew controlled the council at this time. They hated Calvin. They saw an opportunity
To use Servetus against him.
They thought if they could use Servetus to humiliate Calvin or maybe prove that Calvin was too harsh, they could finally break his power. So they made the trial difficult. They let Servetus argue in court. Servetus actually thought the libertines might save him and execute Calvin instead.
He thought he could flip the script.
He did. He called Calvin a sorcerer in court. But eventually, the theology was just too radical. The council wrote to other Swiss cities, Zurich, Bern, Basel, asking for advice, and they all wrote back saying, "This man is a cancer. He must be stopped."
So the libertines were cornered.
They realized they couldn't save him without looking like heretics themselves, so the council condemned him to be burned alive.
And what was Calvin's role in the actual execution? Did he light the match?
No. Calvin served as the prosecutor for the theology. He argued that Servetus was guilty. But, and this is a nuance often missed, Calvin argued for a different mode of execution. He asked the council to behead him.
Why beheading?
Burning was seen as particularly cruel. It was torture. Calvin believed the death penalty was biblically justified for heresy. Almost everyone did back then. But he didn't want the spectacle of the stake. He wanted a swift execution. The council refused Calvin's request, specifically to spite him.
To show who was in charge.
To show they were in charge, not the pastor. They burned Servetus on October 27, 1553.
That is a heavy, heavy legacy.
It is. It's the stain that never washes out. Apologists try to minimize it, but the fact is, Calvin prosecuted him and supported the death sentence. But we do have to remember the context. If Servetus had gone to London, Vienna, or Paris, he would have been burned there too. It was a brutal age.
So we've seen the politician, the disciplinarian, the prosecutor. Let's pivot to the thinker. Part 6. Theology. The Institutes. You mentioned it grew from 6 chapters to 80. What was the big idea? If you could summarize Calvinism on a napkin, what is it?
The core of Calvin's theology is the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self. He believed you can't know one without the other. And his starting point is that the human mind is broken. He famously called the human heart a perpetual idol factory.
Idol factory. That's a sticky phrase. What did he mean by that?
He meant that left to our own devices, we are constantly inventing false gods. If we don't worship the God of the Bible, we will worship money, power, sex, our nation, our children, our career. We take good things and turn them into ultimate things. And because our mind's eye is blurry due to sin, we need spectacles to see clearly. For Calvin, those spectacles are Scripture.
So the Bible puts the world in focus. And this brings us to, we have to talk about the P word. Predestination.
The elephant in the room.
Why is Calvin the poster boy for this? Didn't others believe it?
They did. Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, they all believed in some form of predestination because, quite frankly, it's in the Bible. Ephesians 1 talks about being chosen before the foundation of the world.
Right.
But Calvin systematized it. He was a fearless logician. He followed the logic to the end of the line.
And the end of the line is double predestination.
Right. The idea that God doesn't just choose some for heaven, which is election, but he actively passes over others, leaving them for damnation, which is reprobation.
That seems cruel. It seems like God is creating people just to throw them in the trash.
Calvin admitted it was terrifying. He used the Latin phrase decretum horribile, the horrible decree. But by horrible, he didn't mean bad or evil. He meant awe-inspiring or dreadful in the archaic sense, like a horror movie that shakes you to your core.
He knew how it sounded.
He didn't enjoy it. He felt bound by Scripture to teach it. He essentially said, "My hands are tied. This is what the text says."
But for him, it wasn't about scaring people. It feels like a scare tactic.
No, and this is the irony. For Calvin, predestination was meant to be comforting.
How is that comforting?
Think about it this way. If your salvation depends on you, on your good behavior, your prayers, your ability to stay faithful, you can never be sure. You might have a bad day and die. You might lose your faith.
It's all on your shoulders.
Right. But if your salvation depends entirely on God's choice made before the universe began, then it is unshakable. It's secure. It takes the burden off the human and places it on God. It was a doctrine of assurance for anxious refugees.
I see. It's about sovereignty. God is in control even when the world is burning.
Absolute sovereignty. That is the keynote of Calvinism.
And quickly on the sacraments. We know Luther said Christ is physically present in the bread. Zwingli said it's just a symbol, a memorial service. Where did Calvin land?
He tried to find the middle ground. He rejected the physical presence. He said Christ's body is in heaven, but he rejected the empty symbol idea too. He taught a spiritual, real presence.
What does that mean?
He argued that by the power of the Holy Spirit during the Eucharist, the believer is lifted up to commune with Christ in heaven. It's a mystical union. It's food for the soul, not the stomach.
Got it. So we're moving into the final years, part 7, legacy. After Servetus and after the Libertines are finally crushed in a failed riot in 1555, Calvin finally wins the political battle in Geneva.
Yes. The last decade of Calvin's life was relatively peaceful politically, and he turned his attention to his other great passion, education. He founded the college Calvin in the Academy, which became the University of Geneva. This is huge. He believed that to be a good Christian, you had to be educated, not just in Bible, but in science, logic, grammar, rhetoric. He wanted an educated laity.
This connects to the impact on the world. The outline mentions democracy and capitalism. Let's unpack that. How does a guy who ran a strict consistory help create democracy? It seems contradictory.
It comes back to his view of human nature. Because we are all idle factories, and in his view, totally depraved, no single person can be trusted with absolute power. Not a king, not a bishop, not a pope.
So you need checks and balances.
Exactly. Calvin favored a mixed government elements of democracy and aristocracy. He believed magistrates should be elected to check the power of kings. This idea traveled to Scotland with John Knox, to England with the Puritans, and eventually to America with the Founding Fathers.
So the U.S. system of checks and balances has DNA from Geneva.
It absolutely does.
That is mind-blowing. The Founding Fathers were reading their Bibles, or at least reading people who read Calvin. And capitalism, the Protestant work ethic.
This is Max Weber's famous theory. Unlike the medieval church, which viewed profit with suspicion and elevated the monk as the ideal, Calvin taught that secular work is a vocation.
A calling.
A calling from God. Whether you are a shoemaker, a banker, or a street sweeper, your work is an act of worship. Doing it well is an act of worship.
So excellence is holiness.
Yes. And crucially, unlike Luther, who hated usury lending money at interest, Calvin allowed it. He realized that in a commercial economy, you need credit to start a business. He allowed interest with strict regulations to protect the poor. This opened the door for modern finance in Protestant countries.
He also had to have missionaries, right? He wasn't just hoarding this truth in Geneva.
He was running a command center. He sent over 100 ministers back into France. These men were essentially secret agents. They entered France knowing they might be burned at the stake. They used fake names. They traveled at night. And the movement grew massively, the Huguenots. By the time Calvin died, there were thousands of Protestant churches in France.
It's tragic and inspiring. So how does it end for Calvin?
He worked himself to death,
Yes.
literally. By his 50s, he was a wreck. He had migraines, kidney stones, gout, hemorrhoids, and eventually tuberculosis. He was in constant, agonizing pain.
But he kept going.
He kept writing and preaching. He even dictated his final revisions of the Institutes while shivering with fever.
Sheer determination or stubbornness.
Both. He preached his last sermon in February 1564. He had to be carried to the church in a chair. He died on May 27, 1564, at age 54. He burst a blood vessel in his lungs while talking.
And the grave. This is a fascinating final detail.
This is the perfect ending to his story. He gave strict instructions. He wanted no headstone, no monument. He was buried in a common grave in the Cimetière des Rois. He was terrified of idolatry. He didn't want his followers to turn his grave into a shrine. He didn't want people lighting candles for St. John Calvin. He wanted all the glory to go to God. To this day, we don't know exactly where he lies. There's a small stone there now with JC on it, but it's just a guess.
That is a powerful final statement. Don't look at me, look at him.
It is the ultimate act of self-effacement.
So let's wrap this up. We started with a caricature of a joyless dictator, and what we found was a brilliant, anxious, driven refugee who loved his wife, debated deeply, made some terrible mistakes like Servetus, but ultimately built a worldview that shaped the modern West.
A man who wrote about the dreadful power of God, but also found deep comfort in it. A man who was terrified of chaos, so he built a system of order.
Here's a provocative thought to leave you with. Calvin's greatest fear was idolatry, people worshiping things other than God. Yet he created a movement, Calvinism, that is often so rigid, so focused on the man's system, that it sometimes eclipses the mystery he was trying to point to. Did he succeed, or did he become the very idol he warned against?
That is the question every ism has to answer. But one thing is for sure. You can't ignore him.
And a call to action for you listeners. Next time you see a system of checks and balances in your government, or you feel that drive to do your work with excellence just for the sake of it, take a moment to think of the lawyer from Noyon. You might be more Calvinist than you think.
Indeed.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.